There are places people stop visiting, not because they are dangerous, but because they remember. A narrow road outside town, just wide enough for 2 cars to pass. Trees closing in from both sides. Moonlight breaking through the branches in fragments. Never enough to see clearly. At night, the road feels longer than it is. Engines idle here. Headlights dim. Voices lower themselves without being asked. This was where young couples came to feel invisible. Far enough from town. Close enough to feel safe. That night felt no different. No wind. No movement. Just insects and the sound of leaves shifting somewhere deeper in the woods. A car sat quietly along the edge of the road. Lights off. The engine cooling. Inside, there was laughter. Then silence. The kind that settles naturally, when nothing feels wrong yet. Seconds passed. Maybe minutes. Then something moved where nothing should have. A shape stepped into the reach of the headlights. Not rushing. Not hiding. Just standing there. As if it had always been part of the road. No warning was shouted. No engine roared to life. And then, the first gunshot didn't echo. It was swallowed by the trees. Another followed. Then another. Not fast. Not frantic. Measured. Deliberate. The road did not carry the sound back to town. The woods kept it. For a moment, just a moment. The night held its breath. When sound returned, it came back wrong. Footsteps where there shouldn't be any. Metal brushing fabric. Breathing close enough to hear. Then nothing again. No car speeding away. No voice calling for help. No alarm. Only the road. Unchanged. By morning, the trees would look the same. The dirt would settle back into place. And the town would wake up believing this was an isolated thing. A terrible thing. But singular. What no one knew yet, what no one could have known, was that this was not the beginning. It was a continuation. And somewhere beyond that road, long before the first headline, long before the fear, something had already been moving through the dark. What happened that night would change how an entire town slept. But it wasn't the first warning. By daylight, the town looked ordinary. Too ordinary to hold secrets. Two halves separated by a line one really thought about. One side answering to one state. The other side to another. But sharing the same streets. The same schools. The same quiet assumptions. People crossed that border without noticing. They lived their lives as if the line didn't exist. In the months after the war, everything felt like it was beginning again. Men came home, carrying duffel bags and stories they didn't tell. Uniforms were folded away. Factories slowed. Ration books disappeared into drawers. There was relief in the air. Relief and a fragile kind of optimism. This was a place that believed the worst was over. Storefronts stayed open later now. Music drifted from cafes. Drive-in theaters flickered to life on the edges of town, their screens glowing against the dark like quiet promises. On warm nights, cars lined up in rows. Engines humming, radios low, windows cracked. Young people laughed again. Parents allowed later curfews. The war had taught everyone how quickly life could end. Now they wanted to live. There was comfort in familiarity. Everyone knew everyone. Or at least believed they did. If a car broke down, someone stopped. If a stranger appeared, they were noticed. This wasn't a place where danger hid. Or so it seemed. Maps showed the town as a crossroads. Highways converging. Rail lines passing through. But to the people who lived there, it wasn't a crossroads at all. It was a stopping point. A place you returned to. A place that felt anchored. At night, the streets emptied early. Porch lights clicked on one by one. Windows glowed softly. And beyond the last row of houses, the roads grew quieter. That's where the town loosened its grip. Gravel paths, tree-lined lanes, places where the sound of an engine could fade without anyone noticing. Places that had always been there. Long before the war. Long before the town itself. People didn't fear the dark then. They feared things far away. Things overseas. Things that happened to other towns. Nothing like that happened here. That belief settled deep. Passed from parent to child without being spoken. It was reinforced every morning when nothing was wrong. Every night when doors remained unlocked. But while the town was relearning how to breathe, something else was paying attention. Not to the laughter. Not to the music. To the patterns. Which roads emptied first? Which lights went out last? How long it took for the town to fall asleep. It watched how comfort softened caution. How relief replaced vigilance. And it waited. When the first whispers began, they didn't sound like warnings. They sounded like rumors. Misunderstandings. The kind of things people dismissed with a shake of the head. One strange night. One unlucky moment. Nothing more. The town clung to that explanation. Because the alternative meant accepting something far more unsettling. That danger didn't arrive from outside. That it didn't need the war. Or the border. Or a reason. It could exist quietly. Patiently. Right where people felt safest. By spring, that illusion would collapse. And whoever had stepped out of the darkness that first night would already be watching. At first, no one called it a pattern. There was no headline. No warning. No reason to connect what happened next to that quiet road under the trees. It was just another night, warm enough to roll the windows down. The kind of night couples chose when they didn't want to be seen, but didn't want to be far from town either. Engines idled. Radios played softly. The moon hung low, washing the road in pale light. They noticed the silence first. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that feels like something has stepped into it. No passing cars. No wind. Just the hum of the engine. And the sense of being observed. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A noise in the trees. A shadow shifting where it shouldn't. Then the headlights appeared. Not approaching. Not leaving. Just there. The figure stepped into the edge of the light slowly. Not rushing. Not hiding. That was what unsettled them most. Whoever it was didn't behave like someone afraid of being seen. There was a pause. Long enough to wonder if this was a misunderstanding. A stranger asking for help. Someone lost. The voice came next, low, controlled. It didn't shout. It didn't threaten. It sounded official. Like someone used to being obeyed. The words themselves didn't matter. What mattered was the confidence behind them. The hesitation that followed was fatal. They stepped out of the car because they believed they were safe. Because this was still their town. Because this wasn't how danger announced itself. What happened next fractured time. There was no clear sequence. Only flashes. Movement. A sudden loss of control. The sensation of falling without understanding why. Survivors would later say the same thing. They didn't feel fear at first. They felt confusion. As if their minds refused to accept what their bodies already knew. That this was not a misunderstanding. The attacker moved with purpose. Not frantic. Not reckless. Efficient. And then silence. The figure stepped back into the darkness as calmly as it had arrived. No chase. No final words. Just absence. When help came, it came slowly. Passing headlights. A driver who stopped. A door opened. And questions no one could answer. The stories that followed were fragmented, inconsistent. Some details didn't match. Others were missing entirely. Investigators struggled to reconstruct what had happened because the victims themselves couldn't. Shocked as that, it blurs edges. It erases sequences. At first, authorities treated it as an isolated incident. A robbery gone wrong. A personal dispute. Anything but what it felt like. The idea that someone had chosen that road. That time. That moment. On purpose. Weeks passed. The town exhaled. Then it happened again. Another car. Another quiet road. Another couple who noticed the same stillness before everything changed. This time, there were differences, but not enough to be obvious. The same slow approach. The same confidence. The same vanishing act. Survivors struggled to explain what they'd seen. They argued over details. Was the voice older? Younger? Familiar? Did the figure hesitate? Or was that just wishful thinking? No one mentioned a weapon at first. Not because there wasn't one, but because the mind refused to hold onto that detail. It wasn't the object that haunted them. It was the certainty behind it. Investigators still didn't see the shape forming. 2 incidents didn't make a pattern. Not yet. The town wanted that explanation. Wanted to believe this was coincidence. Because accepting the alternative meant acknowledging something far worse. That someone was selecting victims. Learning. Adjusting. And watching how the town responded. Or didn't. Night routines began to change quietly. Not officially. Not publicly. Couples left earlier. Windows rolled up faster. Radios turned off. People listened harder. And somewhere in the darkness, beyond the last streetlight, the figure adjusted too. At the time, police believed this was a single, isolated crime. That belief would soon collapse. Patterns don't announce themselves. They reveal who notices them first. For a while, the town refused to look. Another attack came, then another. Different roads. Different couples. But the same hour of night. The same quiet approach. The same sense that the darkness itself had learned how to move. Investigators began laying photographs side by side. Not of faces, but of places. Moonlit turnoffs. Dead-end roads. Spaces just far enough from town to feel private. And just close enough to feel safe. Each scene shared a familiar geometry. Cars angled toward the trees. Headlights off. Engines cooling. The victims had not been reckless. They had done what everyone else had done for years. That was the most unsettling detail of all. The attacks crossed the invisible line that split the town. One side answered to one jurisdiction. The other side to another. Paperwork doubled. Authority blurred. And whoever was responsible seemed to understand that confusion instinctively. Each incident was over quickly. No prolonged struggle. No lingering. The figure appeared, acted, and vanished, leaving behind silence and unanswered questions. Survivors described the same sensation. Not rage. Not chaos. Control. The attacker used the night the way others used familiarity. Darkness wasn't concealment. It was a tool. Streetlights marked where not to be. Open fields were avoided. Isolation was chosen carefully. This wasn't random violence. It was selective. Law enforcement began to speak more cautiously. Not publicly, not yet. But internally, language shifted. Words like incident became series. Coincidence became correlation. Timing mattered. The attacks clustered around the same hours. Late enough for roads to be empty. Early enough for people to believe they were still safe. And then the headlines changed. The first newspapers treated it carefully. No panic. No speculation. Just facts laid out in columns that suddenly felt heavier than ink. Then came the nickname. It didn't come from investigators. It came from whispers. From readers who noticed how the figure appeared and disappeared. How no one ever saw where he came from. Or where he went. The word phantom began to circulate. It made the threat feel unreal. And omnipresent. Once it had a name, fear spread faster than facts ever could. People stopped using certain roads entirely. Hardware stores sold out of locks. Then flashlights. Then ammunition. Porch lights stayed on until morning. Dogs barked more often. And every unfamiliar sound was suddenly meaningful. The town began to change its behavior. But not in ways that offered protection. Only in ways that acknowledged fear. Curfews weren't imposed. They were self-enforced. Couples stopped parking in the dark. Families listened to radios long after midnight. And through it all, the attacks continued. Each one reinforcing the same message. The rules people believed in didn't apply anymore. This wasn't violence fueled by desperation. It was violence fueled by patience. Investigators noted what wasn't happening. No theft. No attempt to conceal scenes beyond darkness itself. No communication. No message left behind. The absence of motive was as disturbing as the acts themselves. And then something changed. The next attack didn't follow the rules. It wasn't far from town. It wasn't hidden behind trees. It didn't rely on lovers' lanes or isolation. It occurred where someone believed they were safest. Where walls existed. Where locks mattered. That was when fear stopped being optional. The realization settled in slowly. Then all at once, if the phantom could move closer, then nowhere was out of reach. The town had crossed a threshold. From unease, to vigilance, from disbelief, to dread. But the phantom wasn't finished. And his next move would break the town's sense of safety completely. When no place felt safe. Up until that point, the town had told itself a story. A fragile one, but comforting. That the danger lived on the edges. That it waited in the dark beyond the last streetlight. That if you stayed home, if you locked your door, you were safe. That belief ended quietly. Not with screams. Not with chaos. But with a door that should never have opened. It was a modest house. The kind repeated across the town in neat rows. Front porch. Curtains drawn. Lights on inside. Nothing about it suggested vulnerability. Inside, the night followed familiar routines. A radio murmured softly. Footsteps moved from room to room. The world outside was held at bay by walls and locks. There was no reason to listen for danger. That's what made the intrusion so devastating. Not forced. Not loud. Just sudden. Survivors would later struggle to explain how it happened. Only that one moment the house felt sealed. And the next it was. The figure moved with the same restraint witnesses had described before. No panic. No hesitation. As if the walls themselves were irrelevant. The attack didn't last long. It didn't need to. The message was unmistakable. When dawn came, it carried a different weight. This wasn't a lover's lane. This wasn't a parked car. This was a home. And once that fact settled in, the town changed overnight. People stopped sitting near windows. Curtains closed earlier now. Sometimes before the sun had fully set. Door locks were checked twice. Then again. Hardware stores couldn't keep up. Shelves emptied of padlocks, bolts, window bars. Gun shops saw lines that wrapped around corners. People who had never owned a weapon bought one. People who already had one kept it closer. Not for confidence, but because doing nothing felt worse. Volunteers organized night patrols. Men walked streets in pairs, flashlights cutting weak paths through the dark. They listened for sounds they'd ignored their entire lives. Every footstep echoed too loudly. Every rustle felt intentional. Police cruisers became constant fixtures, rolling slowly, methodically. But visibility didn't bring relief. It brought questions. How do you guard every door? Every window? Every shadow between houses? Parents enforced curfews without argument. Children were told to come straight home. No detours, no excuses. Laughter faded from public spaces. The town learned how to whisper. And still, the phantom remained unseen. That was the most unsettling part. Despite the patrols, despite the weapons, despite the fear that now saturated every street, there were no sightings, no mistakes, no sign that the presence everyone felt had ever been there at all. It was as if the town's fear had no physical source, only consequences. Investigators struggled to regain momentum. They now faced a contradiction. The phantom no longer needed isolation. He had proven that walls meant nothing. That familiarity offered no protection. That safety was an illusion people maintained for their own sanity. The town waited for another strike, because now it felt inevitable. Night after night passed, each one heavier than the last. Every morning, without an incident, brought relief and deeper dread, because everyone understood the truth they wouldn't say aloud. Silence didn't mean safety. It meant waiting. If the phantom could strike anywhere, how do you stop someone who doesn't need isolation? Fear doesn't just change how people sleep. It changes how institutions behave. By now, the investigation had grown beyond a single department, beyond a single set of rules. The town existed in two places at once. Two states, two legal systems, two chains of command. What looked like one community on a map became fractured under scrutiny. Reports crossed borders slowly. Evidence followed different procedures, depending on which side of town it came from. What was routine in one jurisdiction was unfamiliar in the other. Meetings stretched late into the night. Not about leads, but about authority. Who took control? Who made the call? And while those questions lingered, the phantom remained unanswered. The tools available to investigators were blunt by modern standards. No centralized databases. No instant background checks. No reliable way to link incidents beyond observation and intuition. Forensics relied on what could be seen, what could be touched, what could be compared by hand. And the phantom left very little behind. No clear trail. No consistent physical evidence. Darkness had done most of the work for him. Manpower was stretched thin. Officers worked double shifts. Some slept in their uniforms. Patrols increased, but exhaustion followed. Fatigue blurs judgment. And judgment was exactly what the investigation depended on. As fear spread, so did information. Not the kind investigators needed, but the kind they couldn't ignore. Tips flooded in. Hundreds of them. Phone calls. Letters. Face-to-face accusations whispered in hallways. Every unfamiliar man became suspicious. Every solitary figure was reported. Someone walking at night. Someone cleaning a car too carefully. Someone who didn't belong or was believed not to. False sightings multiplied. Witnesses described figures that couldn't possibly be the same person. Tall, short, young, old. Some swore they recognized the voice. Others admitted they weren't sure anymore. Fear sharpened some memories and invented others. Investigators tried to separate signal from noise. But urgency has a way of distorting priorities. Pressure came from every direction. From the public, from the press, from officials who needed reassurance more than truth. Every unanswered question felt like failure, and failure was becoming visible. The longer the phantom remained free, the more the investigation appeared powerless. That perception mattered, because when trust erodes, people look for certainty, even if it's built on sand. Leads were followed aggressively, sometimes too aggressively. People were questioned repeatedly. Some were watched. Others were quietly dismissed, not because they were cleared, but because resources had run out. The investigation began to narrow, not because evidence demanded it, but because pressure did. This is where investigations become vulnerable, not when they lack effort, but when they crave resolution. A name, a face, a story that makes sense, something to give the town back its sleep. The phantom, however, offered none of that, and the absence of clarity became its own enemy. Investigators faced a dangerous truth. Doing nothing looked worse than doing something wrong. The longer the case remained open, the louder the demand became. Find him. Stop him. End this. And with no clear suspect, no definitive proof, authorities began to feel the pull of a temptation every investigation eventually faces under pressure. Ambient sound lowers slightly. The temptation to choose an answer instead of finding the truth. Every investigation eventually reaches a moment where uncertainty becomes unbearable, not just for the public, but for the people tasked with ending it. By the time the killings stopped, the question was no longer who could have done this. It became, who could they live with blaming? Investigators began focusing their attention on individuals who, on paper, seemed to fit. Men who lived on the edges of town. Men who had been seen at night. Men who carried quiet reputations, not for violence, but for being different. One suspect stood out more than the rest, not because the evidence was overwhelming, but because the story around him was convenient. He had a past that raised eyebrows, a demeanor that made people uncomfortable, a history that could be framed depending on who was telling it. He was questioned repeatedly, sometimes for hours, sometimes late into the night, and eventually a confession emerged. But confessions are not the same as truth, especially when fear and pressure enter the room. The statement did not come easily. It came in fragments, revised, retracted, restated. Details shifted, timelines blurred. Some elements appeared to echo information already circulating in newspapers, facts the public already knew. Other details failed to match what investigators could verify. And then there were the contradictions. The suspect placed himself in locations that conflicted with known movements. He described actions that didn't align with physical evidence. He mentioned objects that were never recovered. When asked to clarify, the answers changed. Again and again, investigators faced a dilemma. Was this a guilty man struggling to tell the truth? Or an innocent one trying to say what he thought they wanted to hear? Concerns quietly surfaced. About coercion. About exhaustion. About whether the confession was shaped more by interrogation than memory. At the time, these concerns were not front-page news. They lived in footnotes, in internal memos, in uncomfortable pauses during interviews. Alibis complicated things further. Some witnesses claimed the suspect was elsewhere during key windows. Others recanted later, unsure of dates, unsure of times. Memory, already fragile, had been eroded by weeks of fear. And yet, no alternative suspect carried the same weight. Other leads existed, but they lacked cohesion. A man seen running. Another overheard speaking strangely. A third who disappeared shortly after the murders ended. None could be proven. All could be doubted. And doubt, by now, had become the defining feature of the case. The killings stopped. Abruptly. No announcement. No explanation. No arrest that truly closed the door. Just silence. Authorities faced a public desperate for reassurance. And reassurance doesn't always come from certainty. Sometimes it comes from finality. The case was gradually allowed to fade. Not officially solved. Not officially abandoned. Just set down. But questions lingered. If the confession was true, why did the details never solidify? If the suspect was innocent, why was the investigation unable to move beyond him? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if the phantom was caught, why did it never feel like justice had arrived? Because unresolved cases don't end. They simply go quiet. If the case was solved, why did the killings stop without resolution? The story didn't end when the violence stopped. In many ways, that's when it began to change. With no clear resolution, the vacuum was filled quickly. And it was filled by words. Headlines stretched the truth, not always maliciously, but urgently. Newspapers competed for attention. Each edition carried fragments of the same fear, rearranged. Descriptions grew sharper. Timelines grew cleaner. Certainty replaced nuance. The phantom became easier to describe than the reality ever was. Articles repeated phrases until they hardened into facts. Struck under moonlight. Vanished into darkness. Left no trace. Some details were accurate. Others were interpretations. But once printed, the distinction blurred. Rumors spread faster than corrections. A neighbor heard footsteps. A figure was seen near the tracks. Someone swore they were being watched. By the time authorities denied one claim, 3 more had replaced it. Fear had found momentum. And momentum does not require truth. Radio broadcasts amplified it further. Voices crackled through living rooms at night, repeating the same warnings, the same descriptions, until they felt omnipresent. People began to recognize patterns that may not have existed. Every shadow looked intentional. Every sound felt deliberate. Ordinary men walking alone were followed by wary eyes. Strangers became suspects by default. Even familiar faces felt uncertain. Because familiarity no longer equaled safety. The phantom was no longer confined to reports or crime scenes. He lived in imagination. And imagination has no borders. Sightings poured in. Some were earnest. Others were products of exhaustion. A figure behind a fence. A shape crossing a field. A man standing too still in the dark. Each report felt urgent. Each one was investigated. None could be confirmed. Yet the volume alone created belief. If so many people saw something, then something must be there. This is how legends are born. Not from lies, but from unresolved fear. Copycat anxiety followed. Not confirmed acts, but the expectation of them. People feared that the idea of the phantom was contagious, that someone else might step into the role, or that the phantom himself was still watching, waiting for the town to forget. Parents warned children without explaining why. Couples stopped parking in quiet places. Night became something to endure rather than enjoy. And slowly, the story detached itself from the events. It became larger, cleaner, more terrifying. Because myths don't need evidence. They need repetition. Years passed. Details shifted again. Witnesses remembered things differently. Stories were retold with confidence that didn't exist at the time. The phantom became less human and more symbolic. A warning, a shadow, a presence, no longer bound to a face, or even to the original crimes. And that transformation mattered. Because once something becomes a legend, It stops aging. It stops being questioned. It waits. Time did not erase the phantom. It refined him. As years passed, the town changed. New streets were built. Old businesses closed. Children grew up hearing stories their parents never finished. The murders were no longer current events. They were memories. And memories behave differently. They simplify. They sharpen certain edges. They blur others entirely. What remained wasn't the investigation. It was the feeling. The sense that something had once slipped through the cracks. And popular culture noticed. Stories began appearing that resembled what happened. But with differences. Clear villains. Clear motives. Clear endings. Things reality had never provided. These retellings offered something the original events did not. Closure. But closure came at a cost. Fear became entertainment. Darkness became aesthetic. The phantom was reshaped. Given form, posture, intention. He was no longer an unknown figure, moving through shadow. He was depicted. Audiences consumed the story without the weight of uncertainty. Without the silences. Without the unanswered questions. And yet, the influence flowed both ways. For those who lived there, or grew up near the stories, fiction didn't replace reality. It reinforced it. Scenes from movies blurred into remembered headlines. Lines of dialogue replaced quotes from newspapers. Over time, it became difficult to say which details had come from where. This mattered, because when myth absorbs history, it doesn't preserve it. It rewrites it. Visitors came looking for landmarks that didn't exist. Locals were asked questions they couldn't answer. Where exactly did it happen? What did he look like? Why was he never caught? The answers were always unsatisfying. I don't know. Not sure. It depends who you ask. Uncertainty doesn't travel well. So people filled it in. And slowly, the phantom became untethered from time. He could exist in any era. Any dark road. Any quiet town. Because the details were flexible. Only the fear was fixed. Even decades later, people reported feelings they couldn't explain. A sudden awareness when driving at night. A discomfort near quiet places. Not because they believed the phantom was there, but because the story had taught them how to feel. This is the true legacy of unresolved violence. Not copycats, not continued bloodshed, but the inheritance of anxiety. A story that never concluded doesn't fade. It waits, and waits. But when legend takes over, something important gets lost. What history cannot confirm. Strip away the headlines. Remove the myths. Ignore the dramatizations. What remains is smaller than people expect, and far more unsettling. There is no definitive suspect. No physical evidence preserved well enough to test by modern standards. No confession that withstands scrutiny. No timeline that answers every question. Only fragments. Partial reports. Contradictory statements. Memories shaped by fear. Some records were lost. Others were never created. And some may still be sealed. Not because of conspiracy, but because systems fail quietly, especially under pressure. Modern investigators who revisit the case face a problem. They are trying to reconstruct truth from echoes. Eyewitnesses are gone. Physical scenes have changed. What survives are interpretations layered on interpretations. And the gaps remain. Why did the attack stop? Was it coincidence? Intervention? A mistake that frightened the attacker? Or was the phantom never what the town believed him to be? These questions resist clean answers, because real life rarely provides them. Sometimes the most disturbing truth is not that we don't know who did it, but that we may never know why. Today, the roads are paved. The neighborhoods are lived in. Nothing marks the places where fear once concentrated. No plaques. No warnings. The town exists. Normal. Busy. Unremarkable. And yet, the story remains unfinished. Because it doesn't belong to the past. It belongs to the unanswered space between facts. Between silence and explanation. Between what happened and what was never proven. The phantom was never captured. Never conclusively identified. Never truly explained. And maybe that's why the story endures. Not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. If you like stories like this, kindly subscribe to this channel. We give you stories like this 3 times a week.